Come on. I need you to help me cheat on a test. Go on. Come on. I need you to help me make decisions. I'm incapable of doing so. Go. You should let me stay up late. Close enough.
Fucking cat. Hi everyone. So Persona 5's out, and as with everything I experience nowadays, it's got its share of problems. Overall, the product's phenomenal. It'd take forever to review every single bit, so I'm going to talk about the few glaring issues in some detail to assuage my mulling and to simply talk about what could have been or still can be fixed in a potential enhanced re-release. Just so you know where I'm coming at this from, Persona 3 is my favorite game of all time, and I've consumed enough Persona 4 media to the point of nausea, but I still have a pretty strong connection to it because of that. I've also dabbled in a good amount of Shin Megami Tensei games, so I've become decently familiar with this whole series since playing my first entry in it, that being Persona 4 back in probably 2012. A few quick notes before starting. 1. Beat P5 before watching this, because here's a minor spoiler warning, and I'm not going to give context to anything, so you need to know what the hell I'm talking about. And 2. Thanks to Atlas USA. Thanks to Atlas USA. I can't record anything, so I have to make do with trailers. Sorry! Can't be helped. And I'm going to do my best to keep it in my pants over waifus, but I can't really promise anything there because that's like 90% of the reason these games are popular. So, did the game with the tallest order ever to satisfy me due to my predisposition to its predecessors and cousins manage to do so? Yeah, mostly. This type of gameplay structure tears into an itch since the day-to-day structure is rare but enticing, and as it turns out, standing in a line going in a nice polite turn order is just as effective now as it was 30 years ago. Combat and dungeon-wise, there's not much bad I can say about it. The advancements here are entirely satisfactory, especially how it's complemented by the social links, well, the confidants, with the unique perks from each. It's welcome to have gameplay more in line with other SMT games, with even demon negotiation being present, although I'd say that's the weakest aspect of the battles. The system is shallow, having to give answers based on one of 4 personality types, and the second response being the decisive one as to whether the negotiation was successful, with the only purpose the first response fulfilling is to feel out what kind of answer the shadow likes. This system could have been augmented with the 5 social stats, as it would make sense to use these in a social encounter. Things like flaunting charm, a test of guts, helping the shadow through a problem, outsmarting it, or doing a fancy magic trick. These are just the first things that came to mind, but using the stats to negotiate is what matters. This would work best as a rare occurrence or confidant perk that takes the form of a minigame respective to the social stat, meaning each stat would have its own. This would add an interactive element to the negotiation, that is, actually having to pull off the magic trick. Successful completion of the minigame would not only net the persona, but also a single point to the respective stat, further marrying the combat and social aspects of this game. Other than that, for gameplay, while the design dungeon structure is welcome, the severe early game handholding and breaks in gameplay to explain a puzzle throughout the game harms the dungeon flow. It does make sense that a group would stop for a moment to discuss what obstacles they've reached, however it's frustrating when I immediately get the gist of it and would rather just feel it out rather than have it explained step by step. It's not so bad in later dungeons as any breaks are brief and simply point the player in the right direction. I also would have appreciated the puzzles themselves being a bigger challenge, especially in the later dungeons. Other than that, though, the combat and dungeon gameplay is exceptional, especially when it comes to bosses and mini-bosses, as well as the difficulty curve always feeling just right. At least on normal, that is. But let's move on to the bigger issues. I should reiterate here, this game is still an exceptional product and I absolutely love it, so it hurts a bit to say this, but hey, that's what happens when you care. So to start with, the biggest problem that covers a lot of territory and is the thing that makes this series exceptional, the thing that has drawn people to this game, these games, whatever, waifus. Not exactly, but close. The girls in this game are great, especially Yusuke. Hey, get back in there. Fucking... Anyway, let's talk main characters. That is, the playable party. The problem here is not that they're bad. In fact, it's the opposite, as I hit my microphone. Individually, this cast is amazing. The problem is how they're used together or lack thereof. The party dynamic is stagnant, as characters become one note when moving into arcs past the ones they star in, leaving any growth to confidant stories. Growth that remains absent from the main story, creating a dissonance between the two elements. It's understandable why there's a separation, as the confidants don't grow along with the story, but as it turns out, humans can grow in multiple ways. One aspect developed through a confidant doesn't have to appear elsewhere and can exist by adding to and complementing the character, whereas the story should develop a character in other ways or show sides of them unknown. Let's use Ryuji for example. His confidant story has him coming to terms with his status as something of an outcast, but in the process he cools down a bit and becomes more reasonable. However, in the main story he's just the loud bruiser group idiot throughout the entire game. Simply having him keep his cool for once or say something intelligent would be all it takes to show him growing. He'd still be his crude, self-righteous self, but he'd be shown to be capable of more. Now back to the party dynamic. The characters should form a dynamic over time that is more organic than the one there. As it is, the interactions end up very static and similar as the roles never shift. Ryuji says something stupid. Morgana makes fun of him. Futaba and or An make fun of both. Makoto says something serious and or focused. Yusuke gives a reasonable or silly response, or talks to himself. And Haru probably says something nice, polite, or unexpectedly insightful. This is most offensive in the chat messages, as the repetition of topics makes for tired banter. Not to say that all of these types of interactions are poor, in fact most are damn good, especially since the characters are likable. Especially Yusuke. There's just a point of exhaustion when the same bit is drawn out far past its due. Ideally, at some point these characters would rub off on each other, where the roles in the group blur a bit and everyone becomes closer. They would be meshing together. For example, something like Makoto loosening up and trying to make a joke and going for a harsh dig on someone, or less specifically, someone filling the role of someone else for a moment. Kinda like, hey, that's my line. Unfortunately, the game simply doesn't provide enough events or opportunities for these types of interactions to occur. Not to say that there aren't any, but it simply needed more of these characters doing who cares what. Whether that be extended story events, because Yahweh knows some of those were really short, or quick outing events involving a handful of characters or the whole crew. Something like, Ryuji messages everyone that they need to meet at the arcade for who cares why, and then a short event plays out with everyone playing the shooting game in their own quirky way, potentially showing a competitive side to someone or an unexpected proficiency for the medium. These outings would be like the invites people send at night for the next day, so something would be gained in the process too. But hey, who wouldn't want to go hang out with their imaginary friends since they're all they have? I have like one or two. Also, the summer section with people just showing up to hang out is a notable example and should have persisted later into the game. And other members should have been included in these as well, or at least the player is given the option to invite the others. This whole issue simply put, characters needed more slice-of-life hijinks bullshit, so dates, events, and hangouts should have been more abundant. That all said, there is one place these characters get to freely shoot the shit, however, it ends up being a poor location to do so. Mementos is filled with hilarious nonsense being spewed non-stop from everyone, but the problem, as we all know, I don't even have to say this, is the continuous interruption from exploring and fighting. The casual dialogue could have been placed elsewhere, like in main dungeons, or expanded on in casual text chats. Something the game never does, even though it makes sense for these guys to be chatting about whatever, whenever. This banter could still exist to Mementos, just not interrupted when opening doors, or hell, maybe even into combat, as those enemies tend to be weaker and you don't have to focus as much. Well, you can get your ass kicked to Mementos. Anyway. There's one final, grander issue involving the cast that I need to discuss, as this may be the game's greatest sin. That being the main party's dependency on Joker and their lack of connection and interactivity among themselves. Let me get up on my soapbox here. One of the reasons Persona 3 is my favorite game is because of the growth of characters independent of the hero. Sure, he helps, but most of the growth ends up occurring because of the plot, not just being blankly stared at and having a single dialogue selection changing someone's life. While I'd absolutely prefer it to be in this direction, it's not a huge deal, unlike the lack of camaraderie among the Phantom Thieves. This game does a very poor job at convincing me of a strong connection among these characters. A connection to me/Joker? Absolutely, no question. But between each other, it's much harder to believe. Frankly, after the Yu Narukami dick slobbering of Persona 4, I was praying Persona 5 wouldn't end up that way, but here we are. Probably worse at that, since characters in Persona 4 actually hung out with each other. I mean, they probably just talked about how cool Yu Narukami is, but still. Not to say it needs to be more like Persona 4, but these characters are very amiable and are partners in crime. Plus, the few moments showing the connections presented makes me need it. Like, Ryuji and An are clearly shown to have a connection throughout the game. Makoto and Futaba are always close to each other, giving off a sisterly vibe. Yusuke is a fucking weirdo and should be on screen as much as possible with anyone, especially Futaba. I can't believe I'm a shipper fag now. And unfortunately, Haru is not given enough time to get close with anyone, but is one of my favorites of the cast from the little time she's around. These relationships going unexplored is the biggest shame of this entire game. Oh, time for this bit. Okay. Alright. Alright. Yep. On a side note involving character relationships, it's upsetting there isn't more moments that account a possible romantic relationship in the main story. I feel at the very least, I didn't have to take my pants off yet. I feel at the very least this should be included, as it's very jarring when it's like, hey, aren't we dating? This should play out differently, right? But honestly, that's just too difficult to account for considering the amount of slutting this game allows. But considering waifus, there we go, are one of the biggest draws and keeps discussion of these games alive much after their time, the systems involving the waifu should be as extensive as needed. And I believe this needs to be said. Yukari's the best in 3, Persona 4 chicks suck, and I wake up with a different favorite from 5 every day. Okay, alright, enough about waifus. Okay. Yeah, it's just too hot for the internet. Anyway, let's talk about the game world, Persona 5's Tokyo, and how boring it is. Maybe it's due to being based off of a real location, but the inhabitants of this game lack a strong quirkiness that I found gave 3 and 4 a very strong personality. And even with the serious themes 5 deals with, I don't take that as an excuse, as 3 managed it when the main theme is Memento Mori, guess what, you're gonna die, and because Persona 5 has a fucking talking cartoon cat. The ongoing tertiary character stories aren't too terribly interesting either, so I didn't care to take my time revisiting as many places as I'd like when progressing the game into a new state. The lack of weird side quests also leaves the world feeling empty, while I believe social stat checks should be used to deal with odd situations or strange things found in the world to gain something. What is this strange box? I don't know, I'm too much of a pussy right now to check, I'll come back when my guts are huger. On top of this, the continued use of the same music tracks across the whole game creates a stagnant atmosphere. I wanted to play this problem up to the visuals, but remembering the wonder and joy the soundtrack provided early on and until the end of summer was fantastic. It just began to wear thin at this point. New songs to accompany the new semester would have been perfect. I suppose a bit of it is on the visuals, but maybe that's just my strange affinity to the gray void atmosphere of PlayStation 2 games. On a side note involving the final segment of this game, I would have liked the game to go on a bit longer so the bizarre blood rain atmosphere could set in properly instead of being a one-day thing, and so I could max out my 5 rank 9 confidence. And I wish it snowed in November and December. Anyway, to finish up, back to the music. To give a proper judgment on the soundtrack, I'd need to sit on it a bit longer, but as I feel now, all the tracks involved with the combat and dungeons are incredible and some of my favorite tracks in any game. Especially Last Surprise, Life Will Change, and holy shit, Rivers in the Desert. Oh my god. But the tracks elsewhere feel weaker and don't provide as strong of a personality as the 3 and 4 soundtracks. Maybe it's the campiness of those scores, but there's something very endearing about them. However, for the tone this game takes, that is something more serious but stylish, the soundtrack is appropriate, so I suppose these are more inherent issues with the direction rather than the composition. Well, I think it's about time to wrap up. Persona 5 is a stellar product that advanced greatly as a turn-based RPG in the Shin Megami Tensei family, but the social aspects and characters it was especially notable for, that defined it as Persona, didn't progress proportionately to the gameplay, even feeling lacking in places compared to its predecessors. To reiterate one final time, I absolutely love this game, and I wish I could take the time to talk about all the good in it, all the things I loved, how some moments have me screaming, how some moments have me crying, and how wonderful Yusuke Kitagawa is, but that would take far too long, especially that last part. I guess I'll end it by saying I look forward to a potential enhanced edition, 2 anime, a fighting game, at least 2 stage plays that I'll never watch, the Persona Q and dancing game crossover, another fighting game, special brand pancakes, and of course, all the pornography.
You never see it coming.